I think that's probably a record. It's taken me 35 seconds to get to anal glands. I arrived home from school one day to find that my mother had taken possession of a cardboard box with a badger cub in it. And it was love at first sight. I mean, I did have a poster of Audrey Hepburn, I think, by then, but frankly, the Kestrel pushed her into the shadows because it was essentially my god at the time. But I'm going to go to my grave never knowing probably what colour T-Rex was, and yet I've got a piece of its bone. We need to let the romance play a role in science as well. You know, it's not all about data. It is actually about the fact that just touching this is just something just absolutely remarkable. I began to realise I could learn more about animals by watching them in their own environment rather than incarcerating them in mine. Everything is there to play a role, and if we want to live in an enriched and healthy community, we have to share it with those animals.
Writer, campaigner, wildlife expert, Chris Packham, everyone, give it up. Welcome, Chris. What we thought we'd do today is a bit like a biological desert island discs. So I've asked Chris to pick the 6 species that have meant the most to him throughout his life. Chris, over to you. We're going to start with badgers.
We're going to start with badgers because way back in 1975, I was standing on the banks of the River Itchen, and I'd been studying kestrels for a little while. And I was standing on a badger set, and I realised that I really didn't know too much about these animals. But I've been speaking to my biology master, and he told me about some work that was being done in East Africa by a man called Hans Krug, who was tracking hyenas by feeding them marked food. And I knew that badgers used latrines, so the badger uses its feces, which are anointed with fluids from its anal glands. I think that's probably a record. It's taken me 35 seconds to get to anal glands. But that's an individual perfume that's put onto the feces by every single badger, so they know one another as individuals. And they use these to mark their territories. And in that area, I'd noticed that there were a large number of badger latrines. So I got some peanuts, and I got some molasses, and I got some plastic. And I started feeding the badgers on each of 3 sets with the marked food. And then I would go round to all of their latrines and peer very closely at their poo to see which badgers from which sets were using which latrines, and I was able to map their territories. And I was tremendously excited by this sort of, not very...
What age was this again?
Sorry?
What age were you for this?
So I was about sort of 16, 17, and I studied the badgers in that area and those in the New Forest until my undergraduate thesis. I used that work. In fact, I went to Southampton University, and one of the pretexts that I argued to get an unconditional offer was that I couldn't dump all the data that I'd got on my badgers. So they were very kindly, they gave me a place there. And of course, in more recent times, I, along with many others, have needed to stand up for badgers because of the hideous badger cull, which is still rolling out across the UK. The cull is unfounded in terms of its science. It's been consistently examined and found to be not useful in controlling bovine tuberculosis, which is a very serious disease that needs addressing. There's no ambiguity about that. But very sadly, it was a political issue at the outset, and it remains a political issue to this day. There are solutions, and they are, could be implemented in terms of the cattle testing, which is not particularly useful, biosecurity, of course, and so on and so forth. So the badger's been close to my heart. And on one occasion, I used to always have wild animals at home, and the local RSPCA inspector, who had, unfortunately, too much on his plate with domestic animals to deal with wild animals, would sometimes bring injured animals and give them to me. I lived on the edge of Southampton at this point, and my role was to try and rehabilitate them. Anyway, I arrived home from school one day to find that my mother had taken possession of a cardboard box with a badger cub in it, and it was love at first sight. And obviously, I was instructed that the badger had to stay in the garden. The badger was never allowed in the house. My mum would always say that about my animals. Anyway, one evening, I think my parents were watching Softly, Softly or some tiresome TV detective show, and I smuggled the badger upstairs beneath my jumper into the bedroom where I went to sleep, and the badger went to sleep, so all was well. Until about X in the morning, when all hell broke loose beneath my bed, and my father came storming in, and the badger was in the process of dismembering my Skeletrix set and my Subbuteo teams. Subbuteo, you have to be of an age to remember that. But suffice to say that the badger beheaded Francis Lee, who played for Manchester City at that time. So I always thought that was quite an achievement for a young badger, to behead one of the world's leading footballers. And then my father used a broom to extract the badger, and it was put back outside into its enclosure. So yeah, close affinity with badgers, and I still see them now. We have a set near the house where during lockdown, Megs and I were filming them and feeding them every day. And due to the quiet nature of it, we had some really close encounters. And I love the smell of a badger. I did bring this in, actually. So I've brought a few props. And this is one of my badger skulls. I've always collected skulls from about the age of 8. And the badgers have got a very robust skull with all of its nasal sutures are fused. And the other thing that you'll notice, even if you're right at the back, is if I open the lower mandibles, they basically remain attached to the skull because this animal has such a formidable bite. Why has it got a formidable bite if it spends most of its time eating earthworms? Well, because up until a few thousand years ago, it would have been regularly attacked by wolves, bears and lynx and would have needed to fight back. But there we are. It's a great animal, the badger, and it needs our help more than ever.
It's remarkable that a lot of the animals that we're going to talk about, you've had a relationship with them from when you were very young. And let's move on to the next one, because that's something that's really special to you, isn't it?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I was mainly into animals that I could capture and bring into the bedroom. So it was tadpoles in jam jars and lizards in tanks and things like that. And then when I was about 12 years old, well, I was 12 years old, my dad bought me a really rickety old pair of binoculars, and I started watching birds. But up until that point, I was quite into dead birds because I could pick them up and see them and examine them. But because they had the capacity to fly off, they weren't really on my zone. You know, I needed tangible things. But then I had the binoculars, and I began to realise I could learn more about animals by watching them in their own environment rather than incarcerating them in mine. And so I got massively into birds. And obviously my father gave me a field guide as well, which I still have. And you look through at your house sparrows and your starlings and blue tits and wood pigeons. But as a young, enthusiastic ornithologist, you're drawn to the sexiest birds, which would have been golden eagles and white-tailed eagles and red kites. Remember, this is the 70s, early 70s. Before these birds had been successfully reintroduced and were as common as they are today. But the one that lived around me that I saw were kestrels. And I fell in love with kestrels, and I set myself a challenge of finding every kestrel's nest between Southampton and Winchester, because when I got home, I'd just get on the bike and go out. And my biology teacher was a ringer, so he would ring the young, and I would map them all. And he was mentoring me as a young scientist. You know, he was telling me how to collect data when I was 12 or 13. So I massively got into kestrels, and then in the summer of 1975, I took a kestrel from a nest, and I trained it to fly, and it was, the most magical part of my life. I was struggling at school because of undiagnosed autism. I mean, no one knew anything about that then, but I wasn't really fitting in. No one else was obsessed with badger shit or kestrels. And for me, it became the epicenter of my universe. And I've got two very, very precious things in my little plastic box today. One is this, which is the only physical remnant that I have of that bird, which is one of its tail feathers, which it managed to break off. And so this, I've had that since 1975.
And what was that bird called?
Well, I didn't have a name, actually, because I just used to call it the bird. It's like God hasn't got a name. has he or she, and the bird was such a massive thing that I couldn't diminish it by giving it a name. So it was just called the bird because it was essentially my god at the time. And I don't really remember much else that happened that year, despite the fact that I have a very good memory, because all I remember was the relationship that I had with the bird. And it was, as I say, magical. I'd get up before school, and we had a patch of what the council called wasteland, never wasted on me, as I always used to say, behind the house, and I used to take it out there and fly it. And I was absolutely besotted with it. It was the first thing I'd fallen in love with. But tragically, in the winter, it got a fairly commonplace disease, which would be easily cured now. But at the time, welfare of raptors, from a veterinary sense, wasn't greatly advanced, and the bird died on December the 6th, and it had quite a profound impact on my life. It's an understatement of some magnitude. So I had a very serious mental health episode, which basically shaped that quite formative period of completing my secondary education, and then the time that I was at college and went on to university. But I do think that sounds very negative, but the pure and simple joy of that relationship and the power and the empowerment that it gave me was something which was very positive. So once the dust had settled about 10 years later, then it proved to be very positive.
How wonderful, and actually really quite what a moving story. I was worried what had happened to it, and that is very sad. I can imagine it being so affecting. It's like when a pet dies.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go on to talk about some of my other animal companions a bit later, but I think that, as I said, it was the first thing I'd completely and utterly fallen in love with, and for me it encapsulated everything that I yearned for in a sort of an idealistic, youthful sense. It was beautiful beyond compare. I mean, I did have a poster of Audrey Hepburn, I think, by then, but frankly, the Kestrel pushed her into the shadows, and then it was perfect, and because I'd obviously been watching its wild counterparts, and I loved the way that they flew and hovered and everything else, and then ultimately, because the relationship that I had with it became all important, really.
Okay, let's move on to an insect. Might strike people as unusual that you've picked wasps.
Yeah, I've always liked wasps, actually. They're very, very beautiful animals, and I'm not one that's easily turned against anything. My dad always used to say, you should always question authority. Don't do as you're told until you've established a reason why the person is telling you to do it. So I would always take, if someone says to me, he's a bit of a wrong 'un, I'm interested to know why. I don't make those sorts of judgments, and it's the same with animals. I never use the P word. I don't like the P word. I think the P word is the one that's got EST after it. I don't see animals that way. I just see those animals as being, essentially, maybe they're out competing us, basically, or outsmarting us. Anyway, wasps are very, very beautiful. Their social life is amazing. They're very easy to manage. At one point, when I'd left university and I'd started work as a cameraman, I had a small flat in the Southampton suburbs, and I was making a film about wasps and hornets. And what I did was, when the queen wasp, only the queen overwinters, and she's fertile, so she's got all the eggs for the colony, and she emerges from hibernation in the spring, and she begins hunting, and then she will build a single set of cells into which she'll lay the first few eggs, maybe 6 or 8 of them, and then she has to guard that and feed. And of course, when they hatch into sterile female workers, that's the start of the colony. And when there's enough, then she won't venture out because she can't risk losing her life on account of the fact that she's got the whole colony's eggs in her body. And at that stage, what I did was I found those nests and I cut them off with scissors and I glued them to a coat hanger. So I had a coat hanger with a tiny little wasp nest on it with the queen on it, and I put one in every room of the house and had the windows open. And in some rooms, because they'd go into the room if the lights were on, I put like a cardboard baffle around. But what this meant was that I had portable wasps' nests. They were all on coat hangers, and I could move them to wherever I wanted to film them. And it was brilliant because that summer no one came round, and I used to drink beer in those days, and my beer supply was always full. You know, no one was coming round.
Is this a wasp in a pint of beer?
Yeah, this is a wasp that's on the back of a beer glass, actually. And this was a photograph that I took on when I was making the film. The thing about wasps is that wasps have got quite a simple neurological sort of program, in the sense that if you don't move, they can't sting you. So they need a number of cues to be able to sting you. Firstly, if you breathe on their nest, they don't like it for obvious reasons. I guess they think you're a bear or a badger that's going to destroy that nest. They don't like mammalian breath. So if you don't breathe on them, that's a good tip. And then the other thing is they can't sting without movement. So when I see people and they're going like this, trying to get rid of the wasp, it's the worst thing they could do. But even then, you're unlikely to be stung away from the nest. And the reason for that is that, you know, each of these animals is playing an important role in sustaining that nest. And remember, its mission is to make sure that when the queen starts laying queen eggs and then male eggs, that they obviously are able to emerge into the environment. So if there's a colossal attack and lots of wasps lose their life, then they're not going to be as able to produce and feed as many queens and males. So they don't want to attack you. I also work with hornets, and I like hornets very much, and I'm very fortunate that when I get stung, nothing happens. So I know some people, and I shouldn't laugh about it actually, the way that we respond to these sorts of toxins is almost unpredictable, and it's extraordinarily variable. So if I get stung, I get a burning sensation at the time of the sting, but then nothing more happens. But other people obviously react very seriously with those sorts of stings and can go into anaphylactic shock. So it is worth being cautious of these animals, but not scared of them. And they certainly shouldn't be persecuted because they play a very important role in our ecosystem. We shouldn't make those judgments. It's not survival of the cutest. It's not all about badgers and dormice and cute things. Everything is there to play a role. And if we want to live in an enriched and healthy community, we have to share it with those animals. So I'm just saying, wasps are wonderful too.
We have reported on wasps a lot in New Scientist, and we fully endorse that. Wasps super important in the ecosystem. Without them, we'd be in a lot of trouble, actually. Before we move on to the next one, hornets you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of hornets this year, mm-hmm. and a few other naturalist friends have said there's been a lot of. Have you noticed more hornets than normal?
Yeah,
this
there
year?
weren't more. I mean, going back to the early 80s when I was making that film, we used to rescue hornets' nests. So myself and another guy contacted the pest control people, and initially it was because I wanted nests to film them, and then if someone rang up and said we got a hornet's nest. Rather than them go and destroy it, we would go and rescue it. So that meant we would have to catch all of the insects, the workers, sterile females, and then we would bash the nest and get the rest out, and then we'd cut it off and we'd put them into special bird boxes that we'd made, because at that time hornets weren't a common animal. I live in the south of England in the New Forest, and they like old woodland and obviously old hollow trees to nest in, their final nest. Sometimes they'll go through 3 stages, 3 nests. So we used to literally conserve them. But of course, with the warming climate, there's been better overwinter survival of the hibernating queens, and they've moved gradually further north. And I see hornets a lot further north than I used to. The one difference with wasps and hornets is that if you have them at home, which I do, you have to be careful at night, because the hornets have got much larger eyes, and they will hunt at night. They'll go out hunting moths, and if any of you run moth traps, you'll know that hornets are attracted to them. So if you have lights on at night, then the hornets will come in the window. And I used to have a regular hornet's nest in a house that I lived in, and every morning I had to get up before the poodles, and I'd have to go out with a glass and flick all of the hornets into the glass and put them out before the dogs got out of the bedroom, because the floor would be covered in hornets. But in fact, they're even easier to live with because there are fewer of them in the nest. So they're very reluctant to sting. And I've had hornets landing on my arm and when I've been close to a nest and annoying them. And they've been biting me with their mandibles rather than stinging me. So they don't want to sting, because if they do, the likelihood is you're going to kill them. And then the devious thing about hornets is that when you watch them flying, you know, the way they sort of waft around like that, you know, they always look like they're a little bit, you know, dizzy and not fully in control of their aeronautical function. But when they're in sting mode, either when you've triggered it or they pick up a pheromone because another hornet has released, has stung something, they become like little guided missiles and they fly in dead straight lines.
That's when you worry about it.
That's when we don't have much time. They always go for the head because they know that that's where it's going to hurt most. Again, you know, they're primed to attack bears and other, you know, mammalian predators. And the thing they will do, which is just like in the sort of cartoons of my youth, is that they will, instead of flying and landing and stinging, they will literally fly and sting and carry on flying. So yeah, pretty smart. And on one occasion, I don't know if we've got time for this, but I convinced someone that, for the purposes of my film, that I wanted to film him being stung by a hornet on the arm. And like myself, he didn't react to them, so he was almost a willing participant. So I made a wooden frame for him to put his arm on so it would be steady, and I set my camera up. We went to a hornet's nest, one that was out in the wild, and so I had the frame, and the idea was we'd excite the hornets into sting mode, and then he'd put his hand on the frame so it wasn't moving, the hornet would sting him, and I'd get a shot of the stinger going into his arm. Sadism. And anyway, and I achieved that, but the problem was that once one stings, then all those rules that I mentioned go out the window, and they just go straight into sting mode. Anyway, I had a butterfly net to try and sort of fend them off as they were coming for me, and I saw one, and it must have been about, I don't know, it was a long way off, and I saw it, and it was just coming straight at me. Anyway, I knew I had one swoop, and I missed it, and it came straight in and stung me in the eye, which I know sounds awful, but it was actually very funny. Well, my friend thought it was funny. He thought it was retribution straight off, obviously, for the cruelty that I'd put him through. And to be honest, it swelled up for about 24 hours. My eye closed, but there was no, other than the swelling, no real pain. And then the following day, I was okay, really, by the following afternoon.
Okay, we're halfway through your the desert island discs of species. Let's move to a bird, and this is not an I thought you might choose something really unusual or tropical. This is something entirely commonplace, but beautiful.
Yeah, it's the song thrush. You see, as much as we are drawn to glamorous animals, and I remember being a kid, I was fortunate. I had my, you know, childhood encyclopedias, and you know, my parents would buy me these sorts of animal books. You know, I like the idea of pangolins and I like the idea of polar bears, you know. But for me, it was always about the things that I could connect with in my community. Foxes remain my favourite mammal, you know. There's no question about that. And that's because I share my community with foxes. I know what they smell like. I know what they sound like. You know, I've had pet foxes or foxes that I was rehabilitating, you know. And so song thrush is a bird that was common in my youth. You're right, I overlooked it, to be quite honest with you. I was drawn to the kestrels and things like that. But what I love about song thrush is the song. Brilliant. Have a listen to this. So I had a house that I rented on an old farm with a small garden behind it. And on one morning, I used to always sleep with the window open, and it was pouring with rain, and there was no other sound but the rain falling on the roof. And I was lying in bed next to the window, and there was a song thrush, and it was right outside. And I mean, I can't tell you, it was just the most amazing performance. I mean, you're looking at a bloke who's lucky enough to have seen the Ramones, the Clash. You know, I could go on, but this was the best performance that I'd ever heard in my entire life. And I like the song thrush because for me, it's got the richness of the nightingale. It's got this repetitive method of singing, so it repeats itself. I quite like that because I don't have sophisticated musical taste, the Ramones, and it's so clear. and so bright. And it always reminds me of, like, imagine you're at the top of a set of church steps and you had a bucket full of ball bearings and you drop them on the steps. The sort of tings and tongs and everything else, they're so sparkly. And for me, the song of the song thrush is so sparkly, and it's accessible. I mean, nightingales are great, but I don't live near any nightingales, tragically. They've declined by 90% since the 1960s. So for me, the song thrush is that bird. And I moved away from that house, and there was a number of losses in the move, as ever, but the loss of the song thrush was one of them. And I moved to a place, and we had blackcaps and we had blackbirds, but we didn't have any song thrushes. Anyway, the garden was a boring lawn, you know. Anyway, so we set about sort of rewilding the garden, and in the second year after we'd started the work, song thrushes arrived. And now, every evening in the spring, in the evening their song seems to be brighter and clearer. I go out and sit outside, and if I'm there, and I just listen to the song thrush, and it brings me joy. And that's interesting, because recently there was some work that was conducted, not looking at song thrushes, but zebra finches, which are a small finch species that are regularly kept in captivity and studied by behavioural scientists. And they found, by observing the birds, that when the young birds are learning to sing, it releases dopamine in their brain. So when they are trying to sing and put their song together, essentially it makes them feel good. They subsequently discovered that as they progressed with the form, by formatting and formulating their song, that made them feel even better. So it's almost like they were marking themselves. You're in the shower singing Clash City Rockers, and you don't quite hit the note, but then the next time you do, and you feel good about it. So what they found with these zebra finches is that they were essentially rewarding themselves. They were making themselves feel good by practicing and perfecting their songs. They were essentially singing, the birds singing was making them feel joy. And what I like about the song thrush is that bird is therefore singing and it's feeling joy. But that crosses the species barrier, because when I hear it, it gives me a dopamine hit and I feel joy. And what's better than that? I challenge you, in the whole of the new scientist arena. You can keep your quantum physics, but because what is better than that? A bird in a back garden crossing the species barrier, causing a dopamine hit, which brings joy. I rest my case.
I used to see thrush anvils in my back garden when I was a kid as well. I haven't seen them anymore, and I wonder, are cats chasing them out of the back gardens? Is that...
Yeah, cats are not good news for song thrushes, because unlike blackbirds, when they fledge, their young go onto the ground. So blackbirds' young will go onto the ground, but they'll also jump around in the bushes, whereas young song thrushes, immediately post-fledging, spend more time on the ground, and they are more susceptible to domestic cat predation. And we certainly saw a significant dip in song thrushes, both in urban and in rural areas. There's been a bit of a bounce back, and maybe some of that is, obviously these birds feed on snails, they feed on other invertebrates, so quite a broad spectrum of other invertebrates, but snails are important. And of course, if you have a garden and you don't tolerate mollusks because you want some, I don't know what, utopian vegetable patch, and you're using slug pellets, then obviously you're robbing these and hedgehogs and slow worms and all of those other, perennial favourites of food, and their populations decline. So we've seen a bit of a bounce back, and they use my path as an anvil. And there's nothing, I get the back door sometimes, and I'm sat there waiting for the dogs, and I can just hear this sort of tapping in the other side of the garden, and I know that a small snail is having its brains beaten out by a song thrush.
We love all animals, but it is still a beautiful thing to see, isn't it? That
amazing.
It's almost like tool use in a bird.
Because they go to the same spot.
Yeah.
So they've identified a place within their territory where it's efficient to carry snails to, because they're not going to fly from one side to another, and they know that that's the best place. And very often, it's a single stone, as we call it, the thrush's anvil. So it's not a collection of stones or one bit of the path, it's a single stone, which this is tool use, basically. And remember, when I was a kid, we thought, before the late and great Jane Goodall's work, sadly recently lost, one of the world's greatest, scientist and conservationist, that only humans use tools. I don't know what was the matter with Gilbert White, because if he'd been looking in his garden, he'd have realised the song thrush was at it.
That's absolutely beautiful. I'm going to sadly cut off this song thrush now and go to another, not bird, but ancestor.
Ancestor of birds, yeah. So T-Rex. So when I was a kid, I was quite obsessed about things. And one of my first big obsessions, like many young people, I imagine, although there was a greater range of dinosaurs now than there was in about 1960, 64 or 5, T-Rex was top of the pops. And I think that the reason I was drawn to T-Rex was a pretty universal one. It was bigger than I could imagine, bigger than all of the things that I'd seen in the zoo. So I would be taken to the zoo, and there were Indian elephants there, and I thought they were colossal. And then when you read in your book that T-Rex is significantly larger, and in fact I was reading this morning, maybe even larger than we thought it was, maybe weighing up to 15 tons. So it was big, that's the first thing. The second most important thing was that it was fierce, but the most important thing about T-Rex was the fact that it was extinct, and I could never see it. So all I could see were representations of it. And I think that sort of made it it wasn't as tangible as other animals, and there was always going to be an enigma around it. I mean, I'm 64, so I probably got into T-Rex when I was 4, so that's 60 years. And what I like is looking at the science of paleontology over the last 60 years to see how we've moved this animal from a lazy, sluggish, tail-dragging dullard into, the remarkable creature that we know that it is. And I mean, this is all wrong. This is a T-Rex head which I have in the garage, because why wouldn't you? I mean, I think of all the things. It's never been very useful in terms of something to have in the garage, but anyway, it's in the garage. But it's got no lips. And I mean, we made a program about T-Rex called The Real T-Rex. Could have only been about 5 years ago. We tried to bring the animal up to date using all of the available paleontological knowledge. So we investigated whether it could roar, what type of hearing it had, what colour it was, whether it had feathers, blah, 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 all those sorts of things. And in the subsequent period, we've learned that it had lips, because the teeth that it has, if it had had enamel which was exposed to the air, it would have cracked up and dried and the teeth would have fallen out. So once again, Jurassic Park, for all of its thrills and spills, they still don't get the prehistoric animals right. We now know that it had lips and it was feathered in parts of its life, whether it was just a young animal or an adult, and we're still furiously debating the size, how fast it could move, and whether it was maybe principally a scavenger or a predator. But what I like about that is that in my lifetime, we've moved T-Rex on more than in the previous 65 million years. And that's a testament to the brilliant science. And we got two great scientists, well, we've got loads of great scientists working on dinosaurs in the UK, and 3 of them I correspond with. One is a guy called Dave Hone, and he wrote a book a couple of years ago about dinosaur behaviour, what we could actually interpret from the fossil remains about how these animals behaved, because obviously that doesn't fossilise. And then Dean Lomax has just written a book, which he's very kindly sent me. I haven't opened it yet, but it's gone straight to the top of my pile, because again, that's picking up where Dave left off, again, looking at how these animals might have behaved, whether they migrated, whether they were social, all of these sorts of things. And of course, advances in paleontological science mean that we have come a long way, and now some of those theories are not simply conjecture; they're based on good, solid information. I have got a piece of T-Rex, but I couldn't get it last night. So the only thing I could lay my hands on was this. It's another treasure of mine, and this is a woolly rhinoceros tooth. So okay, not as glamorous as the big lizard. But what I like about these sorts of things is the fact that I'm touching it. I'm touching something of the fabric of a long extinct animal. And sometimes I think we all go down like a scientific wormhole and it all becomes quite, I don't know, detached from the fuel, the thing that really gets us up. And what gets me about this is that I can touch this. I'm connected to an animal whose life I can barely imagine in a world that I can barely imagine. And I mean, we have a better idea because of obviously petrified specimens of woolly mammoth. But, you know, I'm going to go to my grave never knowing probably what colour T-Rex was. And yet I've got a piece of its bone. So sometimes I do think we need to let the romance play a role in science as well. You know, it's not all about data and so forth. It is actually about the fact that just touching this is just something just absolutely remarkable. I don't know if any of you have had the privilege of ever touching a meteorite. I mean, it's just so mind-blowing, isn't it? You're touching something from the other side of the universe. It's mental.
I mean, I think what you're saying, the connections that we need to nurture with the natural world couldn't be more important to keep that up, to keep doing that. Let's move to the last of your animals, very much not extinct, and the last mammal. Not the last mammal, no. A mammal. The last animal of today, but a mammal.
Yeah, so of all the creatures that I've seen and yearned to see and you know, met, the most important, without a question, would be my poodles. And when I was a kid, I just wasn't into domestic animals at all. We didn't have hamsters, didn't have guinea pigs, didn't have rabbits, didn't have dogs, cats, none of it. I wasn't interested. It was all foxes, badgers, grass snakes, butterflies, you know. And one day in 1980, my mother went out after Sunday lunch. I'd gone home, and I was sat in the front room watching the Iranian hostage siege with my father as it was unfolding on television. And my mother made an excuse and went out, came back a couple of hours later, put this sort of bundle of fluff in the middle of the carpet, and it was a black miniature poodle puppy. And of course my father scowled because he had always said that he didn't want a dog because he didn't want to undertake the responsibility for walking it or looking after it. He instantaneously fell in love with it, obviously. And so did I, and it caught me completely off guard. And subsequent to that, with a few breaks, I've always had black miniature poodles.
Why did your mother choose a poodle?
Well, I have no idea, to be honest with you. My mother liked dogs, and I think the dogs at the time that were quite popular were things like red setters. But I think that she was capitulating to some of my father's, you know, sort of reservations by getting a smaller dog, and maybe one that doesn't molt. So maybe she was. I have no idea. You know, my mother wasn't the sort of person you could ask that question to and get a realistic answer. But anyway, we all fell in love with Max as it turned out, and it just went back to the kestrel thing, and I don't know why I'd not recognised this in that interim period of about, I suppose, it wasn't even 10 years. But I fell massively in love with Max, and then we lost him, and that didn't go well. And then I spent so long telling stories about Max to my partner, Megan's mother. Megan's going to be speaking here in a minute, actually, after me. And that her mother became so bored with the fact that, I'd be recounting tales of Max that she went and bought me a poodle. And then after that dog, very unfortunately, was run over after a year. He died in my arms, and that didn't go well at all. That went very, very badly. And then we had Itchy and Scratchy featured in this picture, and I've got Itchy's collar. And this was the collar that he was wearing on the morning that he was euthanized. It's got little bows on because it was just before Christmas. And I suppose, I'm not a great... this is going to sound entirely hypocritical when I say I'm not very sentimental, but I don't have much, I mean, I've got loads of teeth and feathers and skulls and stuff, but Megs takes those off to schools and kids drop them and stuff. But, this, and this is like, I don't know, this is... If the house was on fire... I might grab Meg's first, I'm not sure, but I'd be grabbing this, because the relationship that I had with Itchy and Scratchy is the only reason that I'm sat here today, because at one point my mental health deteriorated to the point that I considered very, very seriously taking my life, and I couldn't leave them behind. And at the time I hated them for it, because I felt they'd stolen a choice that should be entirely mine. But obviously I grew to love them even more. And they lived pretty good lives. And then, just to sort of finish off on some romance, so Itchy died first. He got cancer, and we had to have him euthanized. And then Scratchy went on for another couple of years, and he had a cataract operation towards the end of his life, and that was going to collect him after he had had his eyes fixed. And he saw me at the end of the corridor, which he hadn't been able to do previously, and he ran down the corridor and was jumping all over me. That was one of the greatest moments of my life. I'd probably say that was the greatest moment of my life. I've never felt so absolutely uplifted and so full of joy as when he came out of that vet's room and then just legged it down this long corridor and was jumping all over me because he could see again. Anyway, he lived for a few more months, and then we judged that the quality of his life was not such that he should be going. We're always very strict about that. I think the greatest act of love that you can bestow upon a companion animal is knowing when to end its life, because it's got to be about it, not you. Anyway, we decided to have Scratchy euthanized. And a couple of days prior to that, the breeder who I'd got Itchy and Scratchy from, and said that they just had a litter, and she'd asked me whether I wanted a poodle, and I said, no, don't be ridiculous. Scratch is coming to the end of his life, couldn't possibly do that. We didn't know that he was going to be dying quite so soon. Anyway, on the morning after he'd been euthanized, I was in the kitchen, and she rang me, and I said, oh, thanks for ringing. I was going to have to ring you later today, and to give you the sad news that we've just had Scratch euthanized. And so we had a conversation about that, and she said, oh, that wasn't why I was ringing. I was ringing to tell you that the litter of poodles, which are related to Itchy and Scratchy, were born this morning. And I said, oh, what time was that? And she said, it was about between 7:10 and 7:15, and that was exactly when Scratch was being euthanized. So, quite clearly it was written in the stars as far as Megan and Charlotte, my partner, were concerned, and I wasn't really thinking, well, I'm going to jump back into the poodle race. But 9 weeks later, Sid and Nancy turned up, and I woke up at 3:17 this morning with Nancy's nose stuck into mine, and it was the best start to a day that any human could possibly have. So I love my poodles more than anything else in the whole known universe.
Chris, we have to leave it there. Look, thank you so much. What a really moving and intimate breadth of conversation we've had across so many different species. Thanks for sharing all of that. We do have a bit of time before Chris is going to be book signing. So if anyone's got a question for Chris, please raise your hand and we'll send a mic over.
Hi there. We talked a bit earlier about tool utilisation. What's your favourite example of tool utilisation?
What's your favourite example of tool utilisation?
Tool utilisation? I don't know. I mean, I quite like cactus finches, but I think Caledonian crows would take the biscuit. So these are birds which live in New Caledonia, and as you know, the crows are the smartest of all of our birds, and typically the raven with its bigger brain in the UK would be the smartest of those. But in New Caledonia, what we find with avian intelligence is the island species of any type, crows, cockatoo, etc., seem to be brighter. And New Caledonian crows will make specific tools to achieve specific tasks. So rather than just like take one spine of a cactus and use it to extract a grub from a hole, they will make out of pandanus leaves a whole series of tools. And some of them are about so long, so it's the stipe of a plant, if you like, or the stem, and at the bottom is a tiny little hook. When the scientists showed me these tools, they honestly looked as accomplished in their fabrication as something that early man might have made. The other neat thing is that the adult crows teach the youngsters how to make the tools and how to use them, and that's brilliant. But the best thing of all, right, is that they keep them. So they have a tool kit. Now, it doesn't last forever because they make them out of organic material, and obviously they will rot away. But if there's a log where they can use one of these tools for extracting something from it, then they store the tool near the log so that when they get back, they don't have to make a new one. They've got one they've already made. New Caledonian crows are remarkable animals, absolutely remarkable.
There's a question over here. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Faye. I'm autistic and have public speaking anxiety. I'm really inspired by your work. Do you have any advice for public speaking? I want to speak out more in support of rare species and species I love, like bats.
So, advice on public speaking if you're neurodiverse?
Yeah.
So, I remember when I started presenting television programs and I had no training, and someone with a degree of wisdom said, there's only two ways you can achieve this. You can either be supremely confident or not give a shit. I don't know, I'm not supremely confident. In terms of sort of public speaking in an arena like this, from my point of view, it's always about preparation. Because if you leave it, if you don't, what doesn't sit comfortably is the surprise of something which can make you anxious. So, I mean, I didn't see the shape of this building before I came here today, but I had an idea of what it was going to be like. And I kind of sort of think, like, today, I'm getting up, I'm going to get on the train. There's going to be a number of hurdles. I actually came by tube today, and that's a real significant hurdle for me. And then I get an idea of this. So when I come here, I'm not surprised. And as a way of explaining that, when I first met Charlotte, my partner, I don't like supermarkets, the environment. I don't like supermarkets, actually. I could leave it at that. But I don't like the environment. And so when I first went shopping with her to a supermarket, I would drive to the furthest part away from the door. And she said to me, I thought you parked there because you were crap at parking. And there was no one else there. But it wasn't that. It was just that it would give me about 200 metres to get my mind into a space where I could deal with going into a supermarket, which is an environment that I find quite uncomfortable. So for me, it's about preparation. It's about thinking, what are the likely eventualities? What is likely to happen? What could go wrong or be difficult? And then for me, that's about overcoming it. You've kind of lived it before you've got there, really. So yeah, I think that's it. It's, time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted, as Churchill said. And if you apply that to your physical environments, if you're neurodiverse, I think that can be really helpful.
Great. A couple more questions. There's one over there.
What's your favourite animal out of all of them?
Ooh. Well, aside from the poodles, I don't know. It's very difficult to have a favourite. What's your favourite animal?
I like axolotls.
Yeah, I like axolotls too, because they're weird. And I had a couple of axolotls once. Have you got axolotls? No? Why not?
They're really hard to keep.
Hey, there's a question for your parents or your guardians. Why is this young person not fully equipped with axolotls? Because they're quite easy to keep. You can feed them on earthworms. I fed mine on earthworms. They're voracious. As soon as you drop the worm in, they scuttle across their tank and immediately consume it. But no, axolotls are great. I agree. I like their feathery external gills. They look weird and unfinished, don't they? They look like something that you might have made out of plasticine, having had a nightmare and haven't quite finished it. So yeah, and I like axolotls. As for my favourite, I don't know. It's really difficult to say. I like things that fly because I rather wish I could fly. So I like dragonflies and birds and those sorts of things. But yeah, very partial to an axolotl, I've got to say.
I think it's going to be a boom in axolotl sales. All right, let's maybe one more. Yeah, there you go.
If you could bring back one extinct species, like bring back a breeding population, what would it be?
Well, there's a can of worms, and there was an interesting debate in New Scientist fairly recently about de-extinction. The question being, really, did we ought to be devoting the resources to that type of science to bring animals back, whilst we have animals on the brink of extinction now that are, where we could perhaps spend those resources more usefully to stop them from becoming extinct? That's the basis of the argument. And you might have seen that one group claimed to have de-extincted dire wolves, another part of the item. I push you to read the New Scientist item. I can't get into the detail of it now, we haven't got time. But they're not really dire wolves, they've just had a few genes changed to make them look like that. But the key thing, I think, when we seek an answer to that debate is, what do we do with the animals that we de-extinct? Because they're extinct for a reason, and that is that they don't have a functional, they don't have an ecosystem to fit in with. And ultimately, if we did bring these animals back, they'd spend the rest of their life in captivity. And I got up first thing this morning with Megan and got on a train, and before we came here, we were standing on the embankment outside the Sea Life Aquarium because we were taking part in a protest because 15 Gentoo penguins are currently incarcerated underground in a bunker of what was County Hall. With none of them have ever seen daylight, none of them have ever had any fresh air, and we think that these birds should be moved to somewhere that's more appropriate. So I don't like the idea of producing animals, whether they're born or not, and all they're going to face is a lifetime in captivity. It seems wasteful. So I suppose I come down, in these grave days of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss, and remember this week we've reached one of the tipping points where coral reefs have gone into terminal decline. That's what the scientists are telling us. I would say that we should be throwing every single penny, pence, yen or cent into looking after the animals that we've got. And as much as I admire blue sky science, and we love reading about it in New Scientist and celebrating it at places like this, we're in a crisis, the likes of which our species has never faced before. And if we don't act rapidly and forthrightly, then we will destroy life as we know it on Earth, including ourselves. And we are very, very close to that precipice now. Increasingly close, like your lifetime close to it, my lifetime, shorter. We've got to start acting and do the right thing. And we've got a toolkit of the right things to do. We've got some miscreants running the world who are proving a handicap to rolling out those recovery methods broadly enough and rapidly enough. And we've got to start standing up and making sure that happens. I was very pleased to see yesterday that the No Kings demonstration across the United States attracted vast numbers of participants, because whatever you think of Trump's politics, he's been anti-science, and the dismemberment of the scientific institutions, capacity to look at climate breakdown, capacity to develop methods to address it, have been systematically dismembered by his government. And that's, I think, an even greater threat in the short term than climate breakdown itself. So I don't know how we've got from de-extinction to Trump. I suppose I rather wish he was bloody extinct, basically.
Well, we couldn't end on a more